It was way past midnight when a frantic 911 call broke the silence of a peaceful Texas neighborhood.
Ma'am?
On June 6, 1996, Darlie Routier screamed into her phone for help as she bled from a knife stab to her throat. She looked at her toddlers lying lifeless on the floor. The dispatcher asked her to explain what really happened. It was an intruder, she said, wailing in the middle of the night while her husband and infant slept upstairs, unharmed. In the quiet suburb of Rolette, Texas, the Routier home stood tall as the epitome of the ultimate American dream. A loving couple, 3 beautiful boys, and a life that seemed out of the movies. Darlie Lynn Routier, born in 1970, was a young woman known to be a doting mother. She absolutely loved her 3 boys, 6-year-old Devin, 5-year-old Damon, and the infant Drake. Darlie would share photos of her picture-perfect family, laughing, playing, and just living life. But behind this flawless facade, there was a struggle that the couple kept quiet about. The family business was failing, and money was tight. Tension grew between Darlie and Darren, who were no longer the perfect couple they pretended to be. The night of June 6th proved to be the last straw, a tragedy that shook this family to its core. It was past 2 in the morning. The house was silent except for the low hum of the TV. Devin and Damon had fallen asleep beside their mother on the couch. Darlie contemplated carrying them to bed, but she felt exhausted, drifting off as her eyes felt heavy. The last thing she saw were her 2 sons sleeping peacefully beside her. Suddenly, she felt another presence in the room. Alerted by the stranger standing over them, Darlie felt frozen in place. The man was moving toward her babies. And then, she saw something glinting in his hands. It was a knife, a realization that this may be the end of their lives. Darlie couldn't recall if she screamed her lungs out or lay stuck on the couch, wanting to move but failing every second. However, in the very next minute, she mustered up the courage to jump up, trying to grab the knife from the stranger. The man turned around and slipped through the kitchen, as Darlie chased him barefoot and disoriented, her heart pounding out of her chest. The man dropped the knife in the utility room. Darlie leaped on the weapon, grabbing it. By then, the man was gone. This is when things took a turn for the worse. The tragedy was far from over. When adrenaline died down and Darlie turned back to her toddlers, they had been attacked. The living room was smeared in blood. Devin wasn't moving, and Damon's tiny chest was struggling for air. Hands shaking, Darlie dialed 911, barely forming words to describe what had just happened. Suddenly, Darlie noticed her throat hurt. She touched it and looked down at her hands. That's when she realized it wasn't just her boys who were bleeding. She had been stabbed too. This is the story Darlie told the police officer when they arrived at the scene, and immediately, something about it didn't sit right. Detectives swept through the house and saw that the garage window screen had been cut. Darlie confirmed it as the window the intruder used to escape. However, the garage floor was clean. Even the windowsill, the one with the screen slit open, carried a thick, unbroken layer of dust. There was no smudges and no fingerprints, no marks of someone climbing in or out. The mulch outside, between the garage and the backyard gate, was perfectly smooth, untouched, as though no one had run that way at all. This wasn't the strangest loophole in Darlie's story. The investigators found the murder weapon neatly placed back into the kitchen, confirming the crime must be staged. Nearly 75 yards away from the house, they found a single bloody sock lying in the grass. Lab results revealed it belonged to both Devin and Damon. When they brought the sock back to the house, the investigators found it matched the ones that belonged to Darlie's husband, Darren. While the children couldn't survive the injuries, Darlie's wounds were deemed superficial. Cuts on her arms and a slash across her throat, missing her carotid artery by only 2 millimeters. Within 2 days, she was discharged from the hospital. News of the tragedy spread through the town like wildfire, with all eyes fixed on Darlie. The loopholes in her story were no longer a secret. People asked, is Darlie a heartbroken mother caught in a legal loophole, or a calculated murderer who killed her children in cold blood? 8 days later, Darlie made her point. News cameras captured a sight that would haunt the public forever. They showed Darlie and her family standing by her son's graves, celebrating what would have been Devin's 7th birthday. Darlie was overhyped, giggling, singing birthday songs, and spraying silly string over the headstones. A gesture that may have been her way to mourn her sons appeared as a disturbingly joyful celebration of a mother in the wake of a tragedy. 4 days later, on 18th of June 1996, Darlie was arrested and charged with capital murder. On January 6, 1997, Darlie Routier's trial began in Kerrville, Texas. Their theory was simple. Darlie murdered her sons because of her financial struggles. But things didn't add up. Yes, the Routiers had money problems, but the boy's life insurance policy was only $10,000, barely enough to cover funeral costs. If Darlie was desperate for cash, why not target her husband, who had $800,000 in insurance? And why did she leave her youngest son, Drake, unharmed? They played the silly string video in court, leaving out crucial evidence preceding the birthday celebration. The footage of the vigil, showing Darlie mourning, tearful, quietly praying for her two little boys that she had lost. The public opinion was divided, as the facts strangely swayed from portraying Darlie as a cold-blooded killer to a woman merely grieving differently. But then, the prosecution called in crime scene experts who claimed the entire break-in had been staged. Blood spatter analyst Tom Bevel testified that casts of blood on the back of Darlie's shirt suggested she had raised a knife over her head, making it consistent with stabbing rather than self-defense. While it confirmed Darlie had something to do with the murders, the defense brought forth an argument that changed the trajectory of the case. It was the bloody sock found 75 yards away that complicated things. Damon was still alive when paramedics arrived. Even the medical examiner estimated he could have only survived for about 8 minutes after being stabbed. However, Darlie was on the phone with 911 for almost 6 minutes. If she had staged the scene, inflicted her own wounds, and planted the sock outside, that leaves her a total of 2 minutes to do it all. Was that humanly possible? However, even if the facts did not align, perception proved to be more powerful than proof that Darlie did it for the money. The prosecution did not let the jury forget about the birthday video. It was later revealed that the video had been heavily edited, with footage of her crying and breaking down before the celebration cropped out. But before the full version reached the jury, they had already come to a conclusion. On February 1st, 1997, Darlie was found guilty of capital murder. The court sentenced her to death by lethal injection. To this day, Darlie remains on death row in Texas, waiting to meet her fate. In the summer of 2008, Cindy Anthony made a frantic 911 call. "There is something wrong. I found my daughter's car today, and it smells like there's been a dead body in the damn car." Cindy made the call to report her 3-year-old missing granddaughter after eavesdropping on a conversation between her children, quietly talking about how the kid has been missing for a month. It all began in a modest home in Orlando, Florida. Casey Anthony, born in 1986, lived with her parents, George and Cindy Anthony, and her 3-year-old daughter, Kaylee. From the outside, life seemed ordinary. A young mother supported by her family, and a little girl who brought joy to everyone around her. However, life inside the Anthony household was far from perfect. 22-year-old Casey often fought with her parents and resented their control over her life. Casey never liked being interrogated about how she led her life, yet her parents found a way to make her life miserable, asking her questions like where she went late at night, leaving her daughter behind. On the 15th of July, 2008, Cindy and George Anthony were informed about their daughter's car abandoned in Orlando and towed away. When George went to retrieve the car, the moment he opened the truck, a stench hit him, a smell of something decaying, only to find a single trash bag inside. Cindy later described it as the smell of death. A month earlier, Casey had left the house along with Kaylee, telling her parents that she would be going to Jacksonville. 31 days later, a desperate Cindy called one of Casey's friends, Amy Huizinga, begging for help finding her daughter. Amy led her to the apartment of Casey's boyfriend, Tony Lazaro, the place where Casey had been living her best life. All this time, Casey was never in Jacksonville. Upon finding Casey, Cindy realized that Kaylee was nowhere to be found. When she confronted her, Casey spun another story. She said Kaylee was safe with her nanny, Zanny. She promised to take her mother there, but the drive became an endless loop of excuses. Casey stalled, dodged, and changed directions. When Cindy realized her daughter wasn't leading her anywhere, she spotted a police substation and pulled in, but the station was closed. So, from her car, she made the first 911 call, reporting theft, accusing her daughter of stealing money in the family car. The dispatcher told her she needed to call the sheriff's office. When they finally returned home, Cindy made the second call. This time, her voice shook as she said what she had only just begun to believe. Her granddaughter was missing. Cindy had overheard Casey talking quietly to her brother, telling him that Kaylee had been gone for 31 days and that Nanny Zanny had taken her. Cindy lost all cool. She barged into the room, swore at her, hit the bed, and ran out to call the police again. And from that moment on, lying came to Casey like second nature, as she sprawled her way throughout the investigation, getting everyone stuck in an endless loop before they realized what was actually happening to them. Casey told the officers her daughter was perfectly safe with a smile so calm and reassuring, one would almost believe her. She told them Kaylee was left in the care of her nanny, Zenaida Fernandez Gonzalez, aka Zanny. It was someone she trusted, someone her little girl loved. But when the police went to check, it was far from the truth. The apartment Casey mentioned had been abandoned for over 140 days. It was an empty place with no furniture and no sign of life. Still, Casey stuck to her story. She said she'd been working at Universal Studios, busy with her job, while her daughter was with the nanny. So, the detectives decided to go there with her, and as they walked the studio's long halls, Casey smiled and nodded like she knew every turn, until she didn't. Step by step, her pace slowed. Suddenly, she stopped, turned to the officers, and whispered the truth. "I don't work here," she admitted, like it was no big deal. She hadn't worked there for years, since before Kaylee was even born. There was no doubt left. Casey Anthony was involved in one way or another. On that day, she would be arrested, and the case of a missing child opened in the courts of Florida. For months, the search for little Kaylee Anthony had gripped the nation. Her grandparents appeared on television, pleading, praying, and hoping she was still alive. On October 22, 2008, Casey's parents looked into the cameras on NBC's Today Show, their voices trembling but certain. Kaylee will be found, but the truth was already buried, just not unearthed yet. In August, a local meter reader named Roy Kronk went into a wooded area to relieve himself. The area was close to the Anthony home. Suddenly, he stumbled upon something strange, a gray bag emitting a foul smell, and something that looked horribly like a skull. He immediately ran to call the police, but then he was directed by the sheriff's office to call a tip line, which he did, receiving no return call. 2 days later, he called again. This time, 2 officers arrived. Roy pointed toward the woods, explaining exactly where he'd seen the skull. But after a brief, surface-level search, the officers reported finding nothing unusual. Not giving up, on 11th of December 2008, Roy Kronk called the police a third time. This is when they found the remains of a child in a trash bag. Duct tape clung to the strands of blonde hair still attached to the skull. Bits of tissue remained, fragile and decaying. As investigators scoured the area over the next few days, more bones surfaced, scattered and half buried beneath the leaves. And just like that, the search for a missing girl ended, because Kaylee had never been missing. She had been dead the whole time. On December 19, 2008, the medical examiner confirmed Cindy and George's worst nightmare. The remains belonged to Kaylee Marie Anthony. Her death was ruled a homicide, yet the cause was still undetermined. On October 14, 2008, a grand jury handed down an indictment that would make headlines across America. Casey Anthony was charged with first-degree murder, aggravated child abuse, aggravated manslaughter of a child, and 4 counts of providing false information to the police. She was ordered to be held without bond. Just a week later, prosecutors dropped the child neglect charges, claiming that those charges only applied if Kaylee had still been alive. On October 28, Casey stood before the court and pleaded not guilty to every single charge. Her defense painted her as a confused young woman caught in a tragedy, while the state prepared to prove she was something far darker. By April 13, 2009, prosecutors made their position clear. They would seek the death penalty. The case of the mother who partied while her daughter was missing was now officially a capital murder trial. They said Casey wanted her life back, the freedom, the parties, the men, the rush of youth that motherhood had stolen from her. According to them, Kaylee's death wasn't an accident. It was an act of liberation. They argued that Casey had used chloroform to render her daughter unconscious before suffocating her with duct tape. Then, they said, she placed the tiny body in her car trunk, the same car that later reeked of decomposition, and eventually dumped her remains in the woods, less than a mile from her house. And while her daughter was missing, Casey was out partying, seemingly without a care in the world. They showed photos of her at clubs and pointed to the tattoo she had gotten during that time. The words said, Bella Vita, meaning beautiful life. To them, it was her claiming victory, a celebration of newfound freedom bought with her daughter's life. And her lies to the prosecution were the final nail in the coffin. They said her calm demeanor, her emotionless face, her stories about a fictional nanny, and a job she didn't have, all screamed guilt. But the defense turned the tragedy of a kid found annihilated deep in the forest into a story of a daughter manipulated by her family, claiming that Kaylee had drowned in the family's swimming pool as Casey panicked, but it was her father who helped her cover it up. As the trial moved into its second week, the prosecution began to unravel the family's tangled web of lies. They called Casey's own family to the stand. George Anthony was the first to testify. The courtroom felt hauntingly silent as prosecutors pressed him with difficult questions. The defense, who once claimed that Casey was manipulated by her family, now questioned George, claiming that he had sexually abused his daughter. George denied it firmly, visibly shaken, and the moment set the stage for what was to come. Both George and Casey's then boyfriend testified that during the time Kaylee was missing, they did not smell anything resembling human decomposition when Casey visited them in her car. But that detail didn't hold for long. When George went to pick up the car from the tow yard on July 15, he said that the smell hit him instantly, a stench disturbingly similar to human decomposition. And then Cindy Anthony was called to take the stand. The same woman whose frantic 911 call started the investigation now told the jury that her claim, "It smells like there's been a dead body in the damn car," was merely a figure of speech. She just wanted the police to take her seriously, Cindy claimed, contradicting everything that she had said earlier in her statements to the investigators. By the third week of the trial, the courtroom had shifted from emotional testimonies to cold, hard facts. John Dennis Bradley, a software designer brought in to recover deleted browser data from the Anthony family's computer. Someone had searched for chloroform 84 times, alongside queries for household weapons and neckbreaking. He would later claim that a bug in his computer miscalculated the numbers and that the word chloroform was searched only once. 2 police dog handlers confirmed that the cadaver dogs had detected human composition. One dog alerted to Casey's car, another to the Anthony family's backyard. And then, Chief Medical Examiner Jan Garavaglia testified for the prosecution that Kaylee's death was a homicide, including the fact that her death had not been reported and the chloroform had been found inside Casey's car, the smallest amount of which could be fatal to a child. However, on cross-examination, she would admit that Kaylee's toxicology reports came back negative for volatile chemicals. But she didn't waver. Her voice stayed steady as she repeated her belief that this was no accident. On July 5, 2011, the world held its breath as the jury filed back into the courtroom. They deliberated for 10 hours before reaching a verdict. Casey Anthony sat motionless, her face unreadable, eyes fixed on the floor as they began to read the verdict. Not guilty of first-degree murder. Not guilty of aggravated manslaughter of a child. Not guilty of aggravated child abuse. The crowd outside erupted, some gasping, others screaming, many in disbelief. After years of media frenzy, of theories, lies, and courtroom drama, Casey Anthony was acquitted of killing her daughter. But the jury did find her guilty on 4 lesser counts: for the lies she told law enforcement, lies about working at Universal Studios, about a nanny named Zenaida Fernandez Gonzalez, about telling co-workers that Kaylee had disappeared, and even about speaking to her daughter after she was already gone. As the courtroom buzzed with shock, Casey sat still, and for the last time in front of the camera, she smiled. On the night of May 7, 2017, Brooke Skylar Richardson gave birth to a baby girl at her house. 2 months later, she visited her OBGYN to get herself birth control. Realizing something was wrong, her doctor called the police. There was no baby, just Brooke Skylar admitting she had buried her child in the middle of the night, claiming that the baby was stillborn. It all began in the quiet town of Carlisle, Ohio. The Richardson family looked like the embodiment of suburban perfection, a family of 4 loving people living together in a home filled with warmth and comfort. But behind that mask of a perfect family, there were unspoken house rules that would soon come back to haunt. Brooke Skylar Richardson, or simply Skylar, was the golden girl of her town. Entering her teens, Skylar joined the cheerleader team representing Carlisle High School. In April 2016, she started dating Trey Johnson, a friend's cousin. It was her first real relationship, intense and teenage in every way. However, it only lasted 2 months, and the breakup was messy. What seemed like teenage heartbreak turned into a disturbing tragedy. Suddenly, Skylar seemed much happier and healthier, at least to Kim Richardson, her mother, who noticed Skylar gaining weight. This was around the time when Skylar started seeing another boy named Brandon, so Kim naturally thought that her little girl was finally in a healthy relationship. Little did she know, her daughter had been noticing the weight gain, enough to reignite a war she had been silently fighting for years. Skylar was diagnosed with body dysmorphia at 12 years, later developing anorexia and bulimia. Her anorexia would hide all signs of pregnancy. No one knew what Skylar was hiding. A secret not even Tyler, the father of the baby, knew, but they were about to find out soon. May 5th, 2017 marked the day Skylar realized her secret could no longer hide itself. Wearing a glittering red prom dress, the night began like a dream. While on the dance floor with Brandon, suddenly, Skylar gripped her lower abdomen. Sharp pains struck her pelvis as she crumbled on the floor. But then, Skylar gathered herself, told Brandon they were just cramps, unaware that his girlfriend was in labor. Brandon comforted her through the night as the flashbacks ran in Skylar's mind. A week earlier, Skylar had burst into tears at her OBGYN's office. The doctor told her she was 8 months pregnant and would give birth soon, though she didn't realize soon meant just days away. 2 days after prom, on the night of May 7th, Skylar went into labor alone in her bathroom. The baby, a girl she later named Annabelle, was born and fell into the toilet. Skylar lifted her, but the baby wasn't breathing. She quietly went outside, took a garden spade from the garage, and dug a small grave between the 2 pine trees in her backyard. She placed the baby inside and covered her with dirt, leaving flowers from prom on the grave. Then she cleaned the bathroom, went to bed, and by morning acted as if nothing had happened. A week later, Skylar texted her mother from the gym, telling her that she was happy to get her belly back, and she was never letting it be like that again. Back at the doctor's office, Skylar admitted to have given birth, only that the child was stillborn and she had buried it a long time ago. On July 14, 2017, police arrived at the Richardson home soon after receiving a complaint from the OBGYN. They told the family there was nothing to worry about, so Skylar's father drove her to the police station himself, without a lawyer. He would soon realize it was the biggest mistake of his life. Inside, retired Lieutenant John Fain began the questioning. Before entering the interrogation room, he asked Scott if he knew what the investigation was about. Scott didn't. Then Skylar was left alone with Fain. He explained that they had received a report suggesting a baby might be buried behind her home. Skylar froze, and after a long silence, she confessed that she had buried her stillborn baby in the backyard. "She wasn't breathing," Skylar said quietly. "I didn't kill my baby," but Fain pressed on. Skylar described giving birth alone, waiting for any sign of life. When nothing happened, she dug a small hole with a garden spade and laid the baby inside. She denied harming the child over and over, and after 45 minutes, her parents were allowed to see her. Little did they know, their interaction was being recorded this whole time. The footage showed Skylar apologizing, while her parents were in utter disbelief. While the family sat in shock at the station, police were already at their home, searching for human remains. Soon, the quiet neighborhood was surrounded by yellow tape and curious onlookers. Carlisle had never seen anything like it before. 5 hours later, the Richardsons were released, but 6 days after that, Skylar was called back in. This time, investigators claimed that they had found evidence that changed everything. Dr. Elizabeth Murray, a forensic anthropologist, had analyzed the remains and reported signs of burning on the bones. The investigators confronted Skylar again, this time joined by Detective Brandy Carter, playing the role of the good cop. "Tell me about the fire," Carter said. "What fire?" Skylar's confusion was visible, but they didn't stop. After denying it 17 times, Skylar hesitated and then said quietly, "I might have tried to cremate the baby. Just a little." The investigators pressed harder. "Did the baby make a sound? Maybe a gurgle?" "I might have held her too tight," Skylar murmured. "Maybe she moved a little. I'm not sure." Every detail she confessed had first been suggested by the investigators. It was clear she was trying to say what they wanted to hear. Armed with what they believed to be scientific proof of burning, the prosecution concluded that Skylar had murdered her newborn. The detectives had what they needed. Skylar Richardson was charged with reckless homicide, accused of suffocating her newborn before burying her in the backyard. She was released on bail, but her ordeal was far from over. 2 weeks later, the case reached a grand jury. Skylar Richardson was arrested again. This time, the charges were far more serious. Aggravated murder, an offense that carried a mandatory life sentence in Ohio, stood at the top of the list. The indictment also included involuntary manslaughter, child endangerment, and abuse of a corpse. The accusations were gruesome enough to ignite national outrage. News vans parked along the streets of Carlisle. Strangers gathered outside the Richardson home, holding signs, shouting curses. Some filmed through the windows, hoping to capture a glimpse of the family everyone now saw as monsters. Suddenly, the Richardsons had no privacy and no respect. Skylar spent the weekend in jail before being released on a $50,000 bond and placed under house arrest. Soon, the trial, State of Ohio versus Brooke Skylar Richardson, began. Prosecutor David Fornshell led the case for the state, determined to prove that Skylar had murdered her baby, Annabelle. He leaned heavily on Skylar's own interrogation tapes, the trembling confessions about fire, the faint suggestions of a gurgle, the supposed signs of burning on the bones. Even after the forensic anthropologist retracted her statement about the remains being charred, Fornshell held his ground. Skylar's defense attorney, Charles H. Rutgers, stood on the other side, trying to get Skylar empathy from the public, who had only hated her all this time. He argued that Annabelle had been stillborn, that Skylar was never evil, only panicked and afraid. While all of this was happening, clinical psychologist Dr. Stuart Bassman took the stand. He told the court that he had spent hours with her, analyzing her words, her patterns, her fears. Skylar, he said, once mentioned being sexually abused at the age of 12. The prosecution immediately objected because there was no proof or record of it whatsoever. The court struck the statement. Bassman moved on. He then spoke of Skylar's eating disorder, her fixation with control, accompanied by her relentless need to please. Her brother confirmed it. According to him, Skylar and their mother would often fight over eating habits, and Skylar would sometimes steal snacks to eat when their parents were not home. She had to please her mother for some reason. To Bassman, Skylar's compliance wasn't new. She bent to pressure, especially from authority, and wanted to please and be accepted. And in that interrogation room, that obedience turned into horror. The interrogation tapes confirmed her hesitation in admitting something she did not do, subtly shifting from denial to confession. Despite the mounting evidence favoring Skylar, the prosecution stood firm. They dismissed the accusation of coercion, insisting that no pressure or manipulation had influenced her confession. According to them, the interrogation followed proper procedure. Nothing more, nothing less. And then, it was up to the court to decide Skylar's fate. After deliberating for 4 hours, the jury finally reached a verdict. Brooke Skylar was found not guilty of aggravated murder, not guilty of involuntary manslaughter, and not guilty of child endangerment, but guilty of gross abuse of a corpse for burying her newborn in the backyard. The charge carried a year in prison. Skylar was taken into custody to await sentencing. Soon after, she was sentenced to 3 years of community control, but after 14 months, with no prior record and consistent good behavior, her conviction was terminated. Yet years later, the question remains, was Skylar telling the truth, or did the real story remain buried with her daughter?